I would like to just start off by welcoming everyone to tonight's program. So first off, I'll introduce myself. My name is Jaleesa Johnston, and I'm Head of Public Programs and Engagement at the Portland Art Museum. I'll also start off with my verbal description. A verbal description is a tool, an accessibility tool that we've been using here and putting into practice during programs. It's a way for people who cannot see the screen to visualize the speaker and sort of have an understanding of whose voice is coming from whom. So for me, my verbal description is that I'm a Black woman. I'm wearing black rimmed glasses. I have black curly hair that's currently up in a bun. I have on a green sweater. I'm sitting in a room that's quite messy with two very full bookcases behind me. And I would like to also sort of lead with the land acknowledgement. The Portland Art Museum recognizes and honors the indigenous peoples of this region. These include the Willamette Tumwater, Clackamas, Cathlamet, Motlala, Multnomah, and Watlala Chinook peoples, and the Tualatin Kalapuya, who today are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Run, and many other Native communities who made their homes along the Columbia River. We also want to recognize that Portland today is a community of many diverse Native peoples who continue to live and work here. We respectfully acknowledge and honor all Indigenous communities, past, present, future, and are grateful for their ongoing and vibrant presence. And I would like to welcome everyone to tonight's program, Printmaking in 1890s Paris, Auguste Clot and the Nabis, with Dr. Natalia Lauricella. I also want to remind everyone that Private Lives is still on view and will be on view through January 23rd. So if you haven't had an opportunity to see it in person and you're able to do so, I highly encourage you to go check it out. And also a thank you to the exhibition sponsors as well as the program sponsors. Okay, and I also am happy to share that we do have automated real-time captioning available both on Zoom and on Facebook. So if you are accessing captions on Zoom, automated real-time captioning can be turned on by clicking the CC Live Transcript button at the bottom of the Zoom window and choosing Show Captions. Once on, you can click the captions box with your cursor and move it around the screen. On Facebook, captions can be turned on by clicking the settings gear icon on Facebook Live and choosing captions. Just a reminder that these captions are great. They're really awesome to have, but they are also automated, which means that the program does not always pick up all of the vocabulary that's shared throughout the presentation. So there may be some misspellings along the way. I would also like to recognize and thank our ASL interpreters for this evening, Sarika Metha and Dana Walls, my apologies. Thank you both for being here this evening and helping to make our program accessible. And then in addition to that, I also want to mention that for questions, if you have any questions regarding accessibility or regarding technology, such as, you have a question, you're having a hard time viewing something in the program, please enter your questions into the Q&A box on Zoom and someone will respond to you. Additionally, at the end of the program, there will be time for audience Q&A. Please enter your questions in the Q&A box in Zoom. If you're on Facebook Live, just enter your questions into the chat and we either have someone who can respond directly in the chat or they will bring your questions over into Zoom so that we can ask our speaker later on during the Q&A session. And with that, I'm actually gonna turn the floor over to my colleague, the curator of prints and drawing, Mary Weaver Chapin, who will introduce our speaker for this evening. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Jaleesa, and welcome and good evening to everyone. I'm Mary Weaver Chapin, the curator of prints and drawings at the Portland Art Museum. And for our visually impaired viewers, I am a white middle-aged woman with dark curly hair, and I'm seated in an office with bookcases. I am also joined by a special guest, Heather Lamonides-Brown, who is the co-curator of the exhibition, the co-author of the catalog, and a dear friend. Heather is joining us from the Cleveland Museum of Art, and she's come to Portland just this afternoon to see the exhibition. So I'm delighted you could be here, Heather.
Delighted to be here. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Well, I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you joining us in Portland and across the United States. A special shout out to scholar Vanessa Schwartz, who did me the honor of introducing me to our speaker tonight, Natalia Lauricella. And Natalia and I met through Vanessa when I learned of her great interest in color printmaking, and we immediately hit it off with this shared passion, especially for the 1890s. Natalia is a postdoctoral teaching fellow in the Department of Art and Art History at Stanford University and has received her Ph.D. in art history from the University of Southern California. Prior to pursuing her PhD, Natalia worked as a curatorial assistant of collections and exhibitions at the Salon Guggenheim Museum in New York, and she contributed to a number of very highly regarded exhibitions. Now, Natalia is the ideal scholar to help us close out the exhibition, as her work focuses on the network of dealer publishers, printers, and artists who produced and marketed limited edition original color lithographs as part of the development of modern art and the modern art market of the 1890s. Focusing on the technical and creative role of master printers, this work recasts the history of modern art through the lens of labor, artistic process, and collaboration. At the center of this network is the talented Auguste Clot, the master printer who helped Pierre Bonnard, Edouard Vuillard, and Maurice Denis realize their astounding suites of color lithographs in 1899, all of which are featured in the exhibition. And Natalia, I have to tell you, as I've been giving tours of the show, there's been so many questions about these beautiful prints. And people have asked me lots of probing questions, and I said, save them for Natalia. You have an eager audience who is ready to learn, and I look forward to joining you back on the screen after you talk to moderate our question and answer. So for our audience, I would encourage you, if you do have a question, go ahead and type it in now. There's sometimes we find there's a little lag, and then we get all the questions right before we're going to sign off. So welcome, Natalia. It's lovely to see you, and I so appreciate you being here tonight.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so first I'd like to thank Mary Weaver Chapin, who's the curator of the exhibition, Private Lives, Home and Family in the Art of the Nabis, for inviting me to speak this evening. And I would also like to extend my thanks to Jaleesa and Becky for help with coordinating and accessibility. As for my verbal description, I am a white woman with long blonde and brown hair and bangs, and I'm wearing it down. I am wearing a black shirt, and I'm speaking from my office. So there's a door on either side of me, and actually a print with a mountain right behind my head. So before I start, I'd like to thank everyone for attending wherever you may be, and for our local audience in Portland. I hope you have had a chance to see or plan to see the Private Lives exhibition, which is on view through January 23rd. So in my talk today, I will explore the historical context and material production of some of the prints in the exhibition Private Lives. The exhibition focuses on the work of 4 artists, Pierre Bonnard, Edouard Vuillard, Maurice Denis, and Félix Vallotton. These artists called themselves the Nabis, which is Hebrew for prophets. The Nabis were symbolists, meaning they were literary, artistic, and musical artists who turned inward and used their own feelings as the subject matter of their art. They worked across media, exploring emotion and color through painting, drawings, prints, and the decorative arts. These artists were active in Paris in the late 19th century, which was an exciting moment in the history of modern art and a crucial period for the growing modern art market. In the mid-1890s, their work was supported by the newly established art dealer Ambroise Vollard, an important patron of the avant-garde, who is credited with establishing the careers of such major artists as Paul Cézanne and Pablo Picasso. And here I'm showing you a portrait by Maurice Denis of the Nabis artists, and they're in the gallery of Vollard admiring a Cézanne painting. So Vollard championed the work of the Nabis, exhibiting their art in his gallery and encouraging their experimentation in the graphic arts by commissioning fine art prints. So while Vallotton produced dramatic woodcuts in black and white, Denis, Bonnard, and Vuillard primarily worked in the medium of color lithography. So this evening, I want to focus my talk on the color prints of Denis, Bonnard, and Vuillard, particularly 3 print albums that were all commissioned by Vollard. So here we have the dynamic covers for Bonnard's Quelques aspects de la vie de Paris, or Some Scenes of Parisian Life, Vuillard's Paysages et Intérieurs, or Landscapes and Interiors, and Maurice Denis' Amour, or Love, which were all published in 1899. So each print album or suite of prints consists of around a dozen color lithographs, which were expertly printed on thick, fine paper. And as you can see from these images, the names of each artist adorns their album cover, as does the name of the publisher, Vollard. But one person who is critical to the production of these prints is someone often left out of the story. And this person was an important collaborator, the printer. And for the Nabis, one of their key printer collaborators was a man named Auguste Clot. Together, these artists, publisher, printer, and color lithographs were part of a color revolution in France in the final decades of the 19th century. Indeed, the graphic arts were crucial to keeping up the momentum of this period's obsession with color. Oops, let me go back, okay. So Paris witnessed an explosion of color in the second half of the 19th century, when the everyday world became dramatically more visually and materially colorful as a result of the proliferation of new technologies, consumer items, and mass media. Before the 19th century, sumptuous natural dyes remained a luxury reserved exclusively for upper classes and royalty. The introduction of synthetic dyes democratized access to color production in the 19th century, making vibrantly hued products available for purchase by many more people. As scholars such as Laura Calva have explored, in France, urban life was completely transformed by the mass production of color found everywhere, including in such objects as artificial flowers, clothing, and even fireworks. One particularly interesting way that many people encountered this newly color-filled visual field was through prints in the public sphere in the form of posters, trade cards, calendars, and other advertisements. Most of these objects were produced through the medium of chromolithography. Lithography was invented by Alois Senefelder in Germany in 1796 and soon became a popular printmaking process. Lithography quickly appealed to printers in Europe because of its ease and efficiency. As a planographic process, the medium did not require the laborious work of carving wood or engraving metal, characteristic of the early modern print methods of woodcut and engraving. Based on the principle that water and oil resist one another, lithography is a chemical process that involves a thick limestone block onto which an image is drawn directly with an oil crayon and then fixed onto the stone surface with various chemicals, including gum arabic, nitric acid, and rosin. And so here we have 2 fabulous examples of lithographic stones with images on their surfaces from the 19th century. On the left, we have a stone that has on its surface a wrapper for cheese. And so you'll see in the middle, it says Camembert. And on the right, we have a hand-drawn advertisement for shoes. You can see how the images sort of rest on top of the stone surface, which is porous. So once the image is fixed, then the printer would use an ink roller to apply a greasy ink onto the stone surface, and the grease only attaches to the oily image on the surface. The stone would then be placed in a press bed, paper laid carefully atop it, and then the stone would pass through the press so that the image transferred onto paper. let's see. In the early years of the 19th century, let me go back. Okay. In the early years of the 19th century, most lithographs were printed in black ink because it was easy and inexpensive. Monochrome, or black and white, lithographs circulated in books as illustration, in journals in the form of caricatures like this one by Honoré Daumier, or as reproductions or original works of art, such as this print by the painter Théodore Géricault. In these early years, when people did turn to color, printers had to hand color or tint lithographs. Let's see. Oh, it goes, well, okay. But eventually in the second half of the 19th century, it became easier and cheaper to print in color due to technological developments. And we have here some vibrant trade cards that circulated in this period. One advertising a chocolate company and another one advertising a company featuring sewing machines. So in terms of how these were made, printing and chromolithography involved copying different parts of an image onto different stones, then inking each stone in a different color, and then layering each color on paper by pulling one stone after another through the press. The process of printing in color was particularly exciting because of the effects of layering color on paper. Here we have a great advertisement from the 1890s that demonstrates how the layering of color via separate stones would have looked in a step-by-step visual explanation. The development of steam presses in the second half of the 19th century then enabled large-scale printing of chromolithographs, which were commonly referred to as chromos. So chromos became widespread in the commercial sphere, advertising consumer goods and entertainment culture, illustrating journals and magazines, and covering the walls of Paris. They were often printed on cheap ephemeral paper via large steam presses and often in industrial settings. Chromos typically consisted of numerous and bright colors, sometimes up to 20 colors for a single image. And they circulated absolutely everywhere. And some thought that they actually oversaturated the market. Indeed, by the end of the 19th century, chromos soon became the subject of harsh criticism by art and cultural critics, who saw them as cheap, garish, and crude. A notable exception were the posters of the artist and lithographer Jules Chéret, whose work was seen as exciting and modern, but also elegant and tasteful. From the 1870s, he popularized chromolithography in the public as well as fine art world. In fact, his style of poster remains synonymous with the Belle Époque because of his now iconic depictions of female figures known as chérettes in advertisements for entertainment venues, including music halls, circuses, operas, café-concerts, and balls. His posters captured the vibrant visual culture of this period. And in the fin-de-siècle, his colorful posters blanketing the streets of Paris inspired many avant-garde artists to work in the medium. Many of the artists that Chéret inspired were not professional printers, but painters, like the Nabis, who experimented with color in their artistic practice, exploring its symbolic, psychological, and scientific potential. In the final decades of the 19th century, these artists largely rejected France's traditional Salon system and the training that accompanied this program. There, the instructors and jurors' tastes was typically conservative and traditional, and they favored large-scale paintings with historical, religious, or classical motifs. In contrast, avant-garde artists sought new styles and formats, as well as new venues to sell and display their artistic work. And they abandoned the emphasis on naturalism and mimesis, or copying, that was taught in fine art schools, such as the École des Beaux-Arts, instead experimenting more freely with color, line, and form. Beginning in the mid-1870s, Impressionist painters such as Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, and Alfred Sisley attempted to convey the optical effects of light and color directly through paint, producing bright and vibrant canvases. Georges Seurat, Paul Signac, and their cohort rejected Impressionism's spontaneity and developed divisionism, a technique that explored juxtapositions of pure color that would mix in the viewer's eye rather than on the canvas. Other artists of the fin-de-siècle explored the symbolic potential of color. Members of the Nabis, including Maurice Denis, Edouard Vuillard, and Pierre Bonnard, felt that art could not simply be a visual sensation, recorded or copied exactly. Unconstrained by the need to portray scenes naturalistically, they explored color using muted and soft tones as part of a new visual language for communicating an intimate interior state. The Nabis were considered intimists, meaning that they explored what Bonnard called, quote, daily spectacles and modest acts of life, end quote, as Mary Weaver Chapin discusses in the Private Lives exhibition catalog. As the exhibition illustrates, these artists portrayed interior, garden, and city scenes through various mediums, including painting, drawing, the decorative arts, and of course, prints. The Nabis, along with many avant-garde painters of the late 19th century, took up printmaking, and color lithography in particular, as another medium through which to explore color. In addition to Chérè's posters, they were inspired by Japanese ukiyo-e woodblock prints, which had begun to circulate in Paris in the 1860s, following Japan's opening to the West in 1854. And here we have examples of prints from series by Hiroshige and Hokusai. Looking to such works, French artists took up lithography to experiment with new ways to communicate flatness, distillation of form, and color. Their prints were often made with fewer and more muted colors, in part to help distinguish them from the chromos still in the public sphere. The medium also appealed to them because of its lucrative and democratic nature. Through color lithography, artists could display their art in more visible settings, such as entertainment and advertising posters, as well as create multiple copies of original designs and circulate their ideas to a wider audience. The graphic arts also served as a means to publicize their names and strengthen their reputations in a newly emerging art market outside of the formal structure of the Salon. Encouraged in large part by art dealers and publishers such as Ambroise Vollard and André Marty, who saw this as exciting new territory in the art market, these artists found alternative venues and a novel medium for expression in color lithography. As emerging artists, the Nabis took to many formats to explore their new interest in color lithography. Early on, they made posters, and here we have Bonnard's 1891 Franc Champagne, Denis' 1892 poster La Dépêche de Toulouse, and Vuillard's 1894 poster Bécane. And these are some great examples of the flat compositions and sort of muted palettes the medium could offer. They each continued to work extensively in color lithography, making print suites, theater programs, sheet music, even birth announcements. And they each contributed to Vollard's print albums, the Album des Peintres Graveurs, or Painter Printmakers, from 1896, and Album des Estampes Originales de la Galerie Vollard from 1897, which featured prints by an assortment of artists. And then, of course, they each made a suite of fine art prints, Bonnard's Some Scenes of Parisian Life, Vuillard's Landscapes and Interiors, and Denis' Love, all published by Vollard in 1899. So though their prints and posters are also recognizable to us today, unlike Chéré, who was himself both the designer of the visual images and a trained lithographer, the Nabis, along with most avant-garde artists making color lithographs, lacked technical expertise in the printing process. So lithography, in fact, attracted these artists, particularly because of the possibilities it afforded them to work in printmaking without having to master the actually quite complex techniques of printing. Instead, they worked with master printers who specialized in color printing and the material of color ink. The Nabis each collaborated with one of the most celebrated printers of fine art lithographs in this period, Auguste Clot. Clot excelled in color printing, and his expertise in color drew artists to work with him specifically at his print shop, the Atelier Clot in Paris. Before opening his own practice on the Rue du Cherche-Midi in 1895, Clot trained and worked for 18 years at the large industrial print firm, the Imprimerie Le Mercier. And this is this wonderful print from 1846 that gives us some insight into the workings of the firm in the 1840s. And so we can see clearly here the scale of production and the large number of people employed even then. So some workers were responsible for the preparation of stones, grinding them, and chemically treating them for image transfer. Other jobs centered on the printing of a large edition, which were typically printed on presses operated by a printer and overseen by a conducteur, who was sort of a manager or foreman in charge of solving any problems that surfaced during printing. Some printers worked to copy the image from the master stone, or the maîtrise, multiple times onto a larger stone from which multiple impressions could be pulled simultaneously. And then, of course, other printers were responsible for all aspects of color printing. Indeed, labor was divided clearly at Le Mercier in order to expedite the printing process. Clot worked his way through the firm's training program, finally specializing as a chromiste and later an essayeur. So chromistes were typically gifted draftsmen who performed color separation, which involved inspecting an image meant to be reproduced or printed and determining how many colors were required to print the image. So once all the necessary stones were prepared by the chromiste, they would become the responsibility of the essayeur, or trial-proof printer. The essayeur would select the inks, mix the desired colors to best approximate those in the original painting or drawing, and in some cases decide upon the order in which the stones would be printed. At Le Mercier, Clot performed these specialized roles, leaving the other aspects of printing to other workers in the firm. So when Clot opened his own practice, the nature of his work changed considerably. He worked largely on his own, taking on all of the many roles that had been divided among many different workers at Le Mercier. And I want to show you this great image of Clot in his atelier a little bit later in the 1930s at work on an edition with the artist Luc Albert Moreau. So we can see how different the setting was from the industrial firm Le Mercier. Clot's atelier is cramped and small, leaving room for only a few people. Here, the artist, the printer, and Clot's son, André, who would soon take over the practice. Indeed, Clot consolidated the labor that had been divided at Le Mercier. In the period, the artisanal quality of his labor was an important aspect that helped to elevate the lithographs he made above commercial chromos made in industrial settings. The artisanal nature of Clot's work also meant that his labor was extensive for each project. The lithographic process required significant manual labor, from the initial grinding, transportation, and preparation of stones, the eventual correction and proofing process, and finally the operation of the press to produce an entire edition of prints. So let's say the printing of an edition of 100 prints in 5 colors required that Clot pass each piece of paper through the press 5 times. For the entire edition then, Clot would need to run the hand press 500 times, wetting and inking each stone, preparing the stone on the press bed, ensuring color registration, and running the paper through the press. Clot's execution of these steps would have slowed the production process considerably. Lithography's reputation for being efficient within the industrial setting could not apply to Clot's practice, in which he worked alone using a hand press rather than a large machine-powered press that was common in this period. In fact, Clot was often behind schedule on his projects, and many letters sent to him indicate artists' severe displeasure at his tardiness. Nevertheless, artists, including the Nabis, continued to flock to his atelier to work with him, particularly seeking his skill in color printing. Clot was indeed an expert colorist, as is evident in the prints that emerged from his atelier. I want to take a closer look at some of the prints that the Nabis made in collaboration with Clot so that we can explore how they were crafted and in what ways Clot was involved in their production. On a pale silver sofa, a lithograph printed in 5 colors is part of Maurice Denis' 1899 print album Amour, or Love. The album's narrative of a blossoming romance unfolds across the prints through a wide array of colors, from vivid tones to subtle shades of pastel. In this particular print, a woman is perched on a sofa, lost in thought. The designs on her dress, a cheerful clashing of polka dots and rectangular checkers, create a cacophony of shapes and colors against the sofa's pattern. The sofa frames her body, creating a halo effect that separates her from the figure clad all in black hovering behind her. The faces of both figures are washed in the yellow glow cast by the lamp overhead. In this kaleidoscopic scene, their faces stand out, pale, luminous, and serene. Color is paramount in this album, as it was in Denis' artistic practice and theory more broadly. In his 1890 article, Definition of Neo-Traditionalism, Denis wrote, quote, "We should remember that a picture, before being a war horse, a nude woman, or telling some other story, is essentially a flat surface covered with colors arranged in a certain order," end quote. This assertion begins the essay now considered the manifesto and stylistic program of the Nabis. Denis' well-known pronouncement has frequently been understood in relation to his broader theory that art can convey emotion through color, line, and form. Yet, though Denis harnessed his ideas toward the design of each image in amour, it was Auguste Clot who controlled the material of color, mixing and applying the color inks, as well as printing the images. Denis relied on the experience, expertise, and creativity of Clot, a crucial collaborator who played a critical role in the crafting of the lithographs in this album. Color in these prints was assembled, in this case printed, in a certain order by Clot, following dialogue between printer and artist. In these Nabis prints, color is simultaneously a means for the artist's creative expression, as well as a material, color ink, to be manipulated and controlled by the printer. By turning the more complex aspects of the process over to a professional printer, artists relinquished control over the artistic process. Although they worked freely with color as a material in their painting and drawing practice, purchasing, mixing, and applying oil paints, watercolors, and pastels, in color lithography, the application of color ink fell squarely in the printer's domain. The production of color was therefore only possible through a close collaboration of printer and artist. Clot's role was multidimensional and capacious. He dexterously navigated many important aspects of printing color. Before Clot began work on a project with an artist, he had already made important aesthetic and subjective choices in purchasing the ink with which he stocked his atelier. As the advertisement material from this period shows, the options offered by manufacturers were vast. In turn, printers developed expertise in a wide range of colors, ink textures, and opacities in order to best select inks to purchase and use. After stocking his atelier, Clot expertly handled color ink during the printmaking process. When it came time to ink the stones, the surfaces of which held compositions that had been transferred by the printer or drawn by the artist in black oil crayon, Clot first prepared the color by mixing various inks together to achieve the desired tone based on the artist's wishes. This process of color mixing also involved adjustments to texture and consistency, achieved by adding varnish. The printer worked closely with the artist to choose and then mix individual shades of color to ink the stones. But because a print was pulled multiple times over different stones, color production required envisioning and testing how color inks layered on the surface of the page, creating new tones and shades. Artists working in lithography often had trouble imagining the way that color would layer or play on paper. Clot assisted artists by explaining the potential optical effect of layered colors and by advising them on the order in which the colors should be printed. Clot's practice of guiding artists indicates his understanding of their experimentation and his ability to envision alongside them what they intended to achieve. Here we have a wonderful example of color progression proofs for Vuillard's Pâtisserie, or the pastry shop, from the album Landscape and Interiors. We can see with this example how difficult it would have been to visualize and imagine this process of color separation. And we can imagine how difficult it would have been in other prints by Vuillard, in which large swaths of flat patterns overlapped and layered. Much of the collaboration between printer and artist took place in the physical space of the printer's workshop during the trial proof process, where artists worked alongside Clot on the production of color. This drawing by Borchard of Clot's atelier gives us a sense of how that space operated. Take a close look at the bottom scene. In a series of autobiographical sketches featuring places in Paris significant to the artist, Borchard depicts Clot in his workshop, one hand operating the star wheel of his press, while the other steadies the stone. Next to Clot, Borchard includes himself at work drawing directly on a stone. The two men, close colleagues and friends, work side by side, collaborating on the production of an original color lithograph. As Borchard's sketch suggests, many artists spent hours, even days, in the atelier working with Clot. The notes artists sent to Clot expressed a need or desire to visit his atelier to work with him. Some sent Clot short and terse notes, merely letting him know the date and time of their coming visit. For instance, Borchard wrote to Clot in December 1899, quote, "Do you want us to postpone our operations until Friday morning?" End quote. Borchard frequently scheduled meetings with Clot, so his notes typically refer only to logistics and scheduling. Their conversations regarding color would have taken place in person, as his sketch attests. Some artists sent Clot brief notes approving a final color or noting one final correction. Edouard Vuillard, for example, wrote to Clot, quote, "I saw the proofs, that works, but I prefer the yellow of the first proof higher than this last," end quote. Vuillard's notes suggest that extensive work had already taken place between artist and printer in the space of the atelier. And perhaps his letter is referring to the bold yellow background of Vuillard's print, The Two Sisters-in-Law. Indeed, the collaborative work of color production is quite difficult to trace because it was often discussed in person, without written record, and the trial proofs discarded. Trial proofs are studies that show the color, layering, and registration of a print at any given moment in the printmaking process. In the transformation of an artist's sketch into a lithographic print, Clot made initial choices regarding color. Clot would pull a proof for their review, incorporating the artist's adjustments and repeating the process until the artist signed off with bon à tirer, or good for pulling. This final print would then be used as a model from which to print the complete edition. In some cases, however, we get a glimpse into the artistic process through trial proofs annotated by the artist or printer as they discuss changes. Sometimes artists had to rely on letters and annotated trial proofs to communicate with Clot regarding color. Upon receiving and reviewing the trial proof, the artist would typically annotate it by hand, indicating the changes he wished to see, as we see here with this trial proof annotated by Borchard from his series, Some Scenes of Parisian Life. The artist's notes were not usually corrections of mistakes made by the printer. Rather, they were the artist's response and reaction to previous decisions made by either one. Through this exchange, artist and printer experimented with, deliberated, and ultimately agreed upon color. Annotations on proofs illustrate the printer's and artist's wide array of working methods, which sometimes depended on the stage in the printmaking process and on the type of involvement the artist wished from the printer. Some artists, such as Paul Signac, for instance, were meticulous and precise in their feedback, blanketing the trial proof with handwritten indications of alterations to color or composition. Signac's divisionist theory was based on the idea of the juxtaposition of pure color. So, methodical and efficient, Signac conveyed his optical experience through what he took to be the objective and scientific process of pointillism, conveying a scene through carefully placed and distributed dots. As we've discussed, color was paramount to the Nabis as well, but their art was based on a belief that it was possible to convey emotion through line, form, and color. Their notes to Clot, therefore, tended to be more open-ended and ambiguous in regard to color. To get a better sense of how Clot worked with the Nabis, I want to spend some time looking closely at a print by Maurice Denis. Because he lived outside of Paris in the suburb of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, Denis frequently provided to Clot feedback to Clot in long letters and on annotated trial proofs. Although the artist did at times manage to travel to the printer's atelier, the location of his residence in relation to Clot's atelier led to a more vibrant written correspondence between the two than the printer had with Borchard or Vuillard, who both lived in Paris. Denis' annotations and written instructions to Clot seem to welcome the printer's subjectivity on the issue of color. The notes on life becomes precious, simple from his series Amour indicate the artist's desired changes in color and composition for the next round of printing. But his corrections are vague. Notes include yellow more green, lower the pink on the head, and door in dark blue. The labels given to colors and the directions provided left much to the printer's imagination. How much more green to make the yellow ink of the figure's cloak? Which exact hue of pink ink to now use on her face? And how dark to make the blue door? Denis also provided feedback for changes to color in larger areas of the print. He wrote, quote, "Replace the pink and undo the greens everywhere except on the blue and on the woman," end quote. And, quote, "Replace the pale blue with a flat blue everywhere except the pink of the walls and less strong on the woman," end quote. What does he mean by everywhere? And with what hue should Clot replace the pale blue? And what does less strong entail exactly? Again, Denis' language is ambiguous about the locations he mentions and the color changes he wishes to see. His notes are the types of corrections that the artist would make himself to his own canvas. This feedback reveals that the artist is content to see how the printer will interpret his instructions. Indeed, the imprecise language Denis used suggests that he was deciding upon the color he felt best conveyed his sentiment through his exchange with the printer. Denis did not have specific colors in mind, but was using this trial and error process as a way to explore color, mediated through the printer who controlled it. Life becomes precious, simple, is likely based on a real place and experience. And the young woman he portrays is probably his future wife, Marthe. Nevertheless, the way that the figure appears to float suggests a distance from reality, as if the scene is recalled from memory or a dream. In this sense, the image complements Denis' theory, which was based on the rejection of naturalism in favor of the synthesis of sensation and imagination. Denis' theory informed his lithographic print, in which color, as the expression of the artist's emotion and sensation, was materialized by Clot. Perhaps recognizing the subjectivity of color in perceiving it, Denis welcomed the printer's involvement in the production of color. Elsewhere in written correspondence with Clot, Denis provides open-ended feedback to the printer, leaving room for his creative contribution. In a hastily scribbled note to Clot from 1899, Denis wrote, quote, "Send me here the proofs with the separated states and in the following order: 1 light blue, 2 dark gray, 3 pink, 4 green," end quote. Although he does not mention the print by name, it is possible that the note refers to one of the Amour prints, many of which were printed in 4 colors. The letter suggests a familiarity between the two men and an interest in and technical understanding of the process on the artist's part. This letter also indicates, however, that while Denis provided direction in terms of the order in printing color, he also entrusted important decisions to the printer. His labels of light blue, dark gray, pink, and green left the lithographer with significant freedom regarding color. What exact shades and what level of opacity did the artist have in mind? From the prints that make up Amour, we know that Denis preferred light, almost transparent hues of pink and green that would not match the tones preferred by another artist, such as the rich shades of Vuillard or vibrant tones of Edvard Munch, both of whom also worked with Clot. In another letter to Clot, Denis wrote that if the printer could, quote, bring out better the line of the head, the line of the arm, the breast, it will be perfect, end quote. Again, Denis entrusted color and compositional adjustments to the printer with minimal and ambiguous instruction. By 1899, Clot and Denis had already been working together for a few years. So it is probable that the printer had cultivated an understanding of the artist's color uses, and that the artist, in turn, trusted the aesthetic decisions made by the printer. Indeed, in another letter to Clot, Denis wrote that the printer should, quote, choose an intense mauve to suit your whim, end quote. The selection of mauve, an artificial color not found in nature, in this case was entirely at the printer's discretion. The term Denis uses, fantaisie, shows that he welcomed the printer's creativity and imagination in the production of color for his lithograph. The final version of Life Becomes Precious, Simple makes clear that selection of color is essential, and thus that Clot played a pivotal role in producing the lithograph in its final form. Incorporating the changes noted by Denis, the final lithograph is made with 4 pale pastel colors that, hazy and muted, create an ethereal overall aesthetic. The pastel shades that form the female figure render her luminescent, and the lunar tones of her veil reflect a light that seems to wash over the entire surface of the print. Clot conveys the tones and texture of pastel as a color material, adeptly translating one medium into another. The otherworldly quality of the print depended both on Denis' creative vision and Clot's ability to manipulate a color ink to achieve this effect. While the artist likely had a vague conception of the final image in mind, Clot chose the color, Denis reacted, and the print's color scheme was crafted through this exchange. In his letter referencing color corrections, Denis writes, quote, I do not need to ask you to put the greatest care into this work, where your collaboration will be very effective, end quote. The artist recognized the importance of Clot's involvement, accepting and welcoming the printer's collaboration, and understanding its significance in the production of his color lithographs. Denis and his fellow Nabis relied on Clot's skill and expertise in color, welcomed his input on the selection of colors, and solicited his advice on composition, knowing that he grasped better than they how colors would look when eventually printed. Although artists started with their drawings on stone and their ideas regarding color, sometimes as a model or a sketch, they then worked closely with Clot to transform their artistic ideas into a material printed form. Clot was thus involved not only in the manual labor of producing color as a material, but also in the intellectual and aesthetic process. In other words, Clot actively contributed to the conception of color that defines so much of these artists' fin-de-siècle artistic output in print. Clot's expertise with color and his handling of color ink enabled the Nabis to achieve the colors they wished to see in print, ensuring the originality of their lithographs. Critics, nevertheless, remained uneasy about the technical skill and confidence Clot carried over into his atelier practice from his extensive training and experience at Le Mercier. In his 1898 book, La lithographie originale en couleur, which as we see here had a cover designed by Bonnard, the art critic André Malherriot included an entry on Clot. Quote, the color printer at the forefront now is certainly Clot. His flaw would not be lack of skill, but rather a tendency to substitute his judgment for that of the artists when their personality is not strong or assertive, end quote. Malherriot elaborated, quote, the role of the printer, without ever encroaching upon that of the artist, must be to support and help him, overcoming hitches, making the right suggestion at the right time, based on his ability and his deep knowledge of the craft, end quote. According to Malherriot, the printer's role required a delicate balance. An overly artistic printer skilled in color lithography risks imposing his will on an artist unfamiliar with the medium. But a printer lacking technical skill would not sufficiently facilitate the artist's creative work. Close collaborative role thus continued to be considered at once a great benefit as well as a threat to artistic originality, a concern that determined the growing art market's value of the prints. Indeed, the status of these color lithographs as original works of modern art was important to establish in this period. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, modern artists were drawn to color lithography, in part because it enabled them to capture and circulate their avant-garde aesthetic or style in a medium that was more accessible and affordable. These were luxury prints, so they certainly were more expensive than cheap posters or other ephemera, but they were also certainly less expensive than singular paintings. With close expert collaboration, the Nabis were able to produce printed versions or translations of ideas, colors, compositions, or themes that they also explored in their paintings. These prints in turn helped to disseminate their names and build their reputations as modern artists, which was especially important for the Nabis at this early stage in their careers. The dealer-publisher Ambroise Vollard, who helped to promote the Nabis at the end of the 19th century, recognized the potential for original color lithographs to help launch the careers of these artists. The main financial backing for the Nabis print projects came from Vollard, who was also Clot's most consistent client. Soon after establishing his gallery in 1893, Vollard began publishing print albums and livres d'artistes, or artist books. His primary business, however, was the sale of paintings and sculptures by avant-garde artists. He exhibited and sold the work of many major figures in the history of modern art, including Vincent van Gogh, Henri Matisse, Odeon Redon, and the Nabis. Understanding the promotional potential of artist prints, he asked artists whose painting and sculpture he sold to make prints, particularly color lithographs, directing them to Clot's atelier. Let's see. Oops, there we go. In the early years of his business, Vollard established the marketing strategies he would continue to employ until his death in 1939. Vollard arbitrarily limited the edition size of art prints he published, typically to 100 copies, to distinguish them from the large-scale production of commercial firms such as the Imprimerie Le Mercier, where print runs typically reached the thousands. Vollard also ordered special high-quality paper to differentiate his art prints from ephemeral posters and more inexpensively printed commercial chromolithographs. The printer would cancel plates and pull proofs of these canceled plates as evidence that no further editions could ever be produced. Artists then numbered the impressions by hand as a visual sign of their limited edition status. Finally, the artist signed each print. The artist's inscription stands as evidence of the artist's hand and attests to its authenticity as an original artwork. Indeed, despite the printer's considerable labor and involvement in the production and conception of these art color lithographs, the artist alone signed each print within the final edition. Clot's name never appeared on the surface of color lithographs, not only because his collaboration threatened their value in the art market, which relied on singular authorship, but also because Clot's ties to industry had to be made absent, or at the very least, visually and materially undiscoverable, in order that the prints become works of original modern art. The prints designed and signed by the Nabis circulated as part of the color revolution in the graphic arts in 1890s Paris. Commissioned, funded, and marketed by Vollard, the Nabis prints contributed to launching and ensuring their robust careers as modern artists. Yet through close attention to the printmaking process and to the crucial collaborative work of the printer, we can recover an essential, though often overlooked figure in the history of these prints and in the history of modern art more broadly. Although Clot's name never appeared in the form of a signature alongside that of the artist, the printer's hand is recognizable in color itself. Thank you.
Natalia, thank you. That was marvelous.
Thank you.
And I'm heartbroken to say that my computer crashed in the last like maybe 10 minutes. So some of the questions I have for you, you might have answered while I was desperately trying to get back online. So I do apologize. And I'll mention to our viewers, because I had to leave and then come back on, I can no longer see your questions. So forgive me, but if you would kindly retype them, that would be really, really helpful. I made some notes as I went.
Well, it's better that your computer crashed than mine, Mary.
Yeah, right, exactly. There's always something. So if I may, I would like to start with a question that one of our viewers wrote in, but it is also one that I've been fielding again and again in the exhibition. And that is especially when we're looking at Denis' Amour. In the exhibition, we have them installed. All 13 prints are against this deep blue wall. And people want to know if some of them are faded. Can you talk about the range of tones that the artist employed and why some are deeply saturated and some are just barely there?
Well, I would say that they're definitely not faded from light or anything like that. So Denis was, I think, excited to work in the range of tonal possibilities that chromolithography enabled. So it seems to me that he was really interested in experimenting with especially the textures that were possible through working with Clot. So that kind of wash that we see, especially in the print that I spent a lot of time talking about, Life Becomes Precious, Simple, shows that actually, like, through the process of working with Clot, it seems to me that the color became almost more and more muted and transparent. And that was kind of part of the process that I was describing. So I think, to me, it seems like it was a personal preference to be able to work in those like large tonalities, to be able to produce very rich, vibrant blues and greens and pinks, but then also create this kind of hazy, ephemeral, kind of ethereal aesthetic in other versions as well. So I think that was really, I was really struck by that trial proof in my research, because it really seemed to me that the final version is even more faded than the one that he kind of starts with. So clearly he was kind of figuring out what was even possible through lithography, which was a medium that was really, really good at like mimicking other, qualities of watercolor and pastel and of course painting, but really the kind of ability to create a watercolor effect was something I think these artists were very excited by in their work.
Well, and Natalia, I'll add, and you certainly have this experience that studying for your dissertation and preparing this, as well as Heather and I preparing for this exhibition, we relied on the suite of prints in our collection, but we also saw the prints owned by Cleveland and New York and Boston and Paris and Amsterdam, and that these colors are really consistent across sets. So we know that we don't happen to have a particularly faded set and that the real ones are somewhere else. But does that back up what you saw as well?
Yes, I would say so too. And Clot is really expert at, because lithography is a very finicky process. And so a lot of it, from my experience working in, I actually spent a lot of time in the Atelier Clot, which still exists in Paris, working with the master printers there and the whole print team. And what's amazing to me about watching what they're doing is there's so much that kind of is dependent on like the atmosphere. Like if it's more humid, the color might be different, so there's all these inconsistencies. And I think what Clot was really good at was creating a very consistent product, which was really his skill again with color ink, because he wouldn't necessarily have been able to make all of those prints in one go. So having to mimic again the colors that he had achieved the day before or the week before is something that he was very good at. They're very good at, printers are very good at, these kind of colorists are very good at color matching. And so they can kind of create any color that you ask them to, through a really dexterous knowledge of color mixing and the material of ink, because that consistency and texture that Clot is able to achieve with Denis is, I think, quite difficult to do, that kind of wash that he gets.
Oh, excellent. Natalia, we had a number of questions about technique or just sort of the physical aspects of making lithographs. One question comes from a Portlander who is a great printmaker and scholar of prints, who wants to know if you have any evidence of Bonnard using transfer papers. In some of his works, I'm thinking in particular his impression of the I can't remember if it's entitled the Bois de Boulogne or the Arc de Triomphe in the some aspects of Parisian life. You get a sense of texture in the paper. Do we have any knowledge about his use of transfer papers?
It's really hard to know how they each worked. You can kind of find some evidence of it by looking really closely. There are different kind of texture effects of using transfer paper. The problem is that oftentimes, if they did use transfer paper, they would then work on the image, later on the stone. So it kind of masks any evidence that they use transfer paper. So it's really up for debate. And we actually, I think, talked about this, Mary, when we were together once at the Van Gogh Museum study day. How can you really tell if they used it? I think they often did, because especially for many of these artists, it was really, really hard for them to figure out exactly how this worked. And transfer paper was, a really interesting and viable option for many of them. I think what Clot would do is he would typically encourage an artist to try working on the stone directly, but that means they'd have to draw in reverse. It's a whole kind of like mental gymnastics that I think most artists, are not particularly skilled at. Borchard was someone who did work so much in lithography that it's possible that he did work directly on the stone, but no matter what, they would have either worked in transfer paper and then eventually done retouching on the stone. So it is actually quite hard to tell. It comes down to like whether you can kind of see the texture of the transfer paper in the final print.
So I'll say to Dan, who asked the question, we'll wait for the show to come down. We'll unframe the print, and then we'll look at it together in the study room.
Perfect.
Natalia, everyone seems to have loved your trial proofs, the annotated trial proofs. Yeah. And we had a question that came in for me and for you. The question for me was if trial proofs featured in our exhibition. And the answer is no. They are marvelous, but we were sort of trying to tell a broader story in which lithography plays a very important part, but it wasn't necessarily about the making of lithographs. It was more the content. So you will not find any trial proofs in our exhibition, but Natalia, you know where they all are. Can you tell us a little bit about your research and the trial proofs that you were able to use to construct your dissertation and learn about this working process?
Yes, thank you for that question. So I would say that probably so it was interesting to me, especially, and as I kind of caveated in the lecture, Denis is a really fun example because you can kind of get a sense of his work in trial proofs and in letters at the same time. There are other trial proofs where you get a sense of color progression or changes in color, but they're not annotated. The annotated ones are somewhat more rare. There's a really robust, wonderful collection at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam that we were able to visit with our colleague Fleur, who has been collecting them for a very long time. So they've really focused on the Nabis print suites and trial proofs for those. And then of course there are kind of one-offs here and there, the wonderful Signac from the MFA in Boston. So, we've kind of been able to track some down. Signac also wrote extensive, he was such a kind of control freak that he wrote all over his trial proofs as well. So he's another really good example. I think what's fun is to try and kind of piece together different aspects, kind of coming up with a way to trace this collaborative work is very hard. And I kind of mentioned this in the talk. Most of this working relationship happened to get, the printer and artist working together closely, and there's no evidence of, how they work together. So even with a trial proof, I used those as a way to, along with, deep knowledge of the printmaking process, discussions with printmakers who are still, doing the same process today, the trial proofs and letters kind of tried to piece together this working process. And the trial proofs are, trying to understand what those kind of vague comments might mean. I think they probably meant something quite specific to those artists and printer who were like in the middle of this whole project. So it was really fun for me to kind of track those down and to piece them together into a larger story about what exactly the printer was doing and how involved he was in the process.
Well, that said, I suppose we could tell our friends too, you'd love to know about more, right? If some of our curatorial colleagues are watching tonight.
Yeah. Well, I will say that sometimes they were actually collected they weren't necessarily collected, but they were kind of left over in the atelier. And so then they ended up entering the market as sort of like evidence of this working relationship of the artist's hand. But, they kind of like seep out from the atelier at later dates as part of like big, sales of material, which is really an interesting history also to kind of navigate and to trace.
Natalia, to move back to kind of the magic of lithography, drawing on stone, one of our viewers wanted some clarification. Could you clarify about how each color required a separate stone?
Yes. Oh, it's very complicated. I'm glad someone asked this. So it's easy. This is why I kind of started with those lithographic stones. It's nice to be able to see them on a limestone block like that. But essentially what happened is the cheese wrapper one that I showed, the camembert cheese wrapper, actually would have been printed in multiple colors. And so what would happen is that's what's called the maîtrise, or the master stone, which for a company like Le Mercier, that cheese wrapper company, that company would have, consistently been, ordering more and more wrappers. So they would have kept that on the shelf. And then in order to print one, they would pull that maîtrise or master stone from the shelf. And they would use what's called, it's called fin-de-siècle, the process where essentially they would take a sort of transfer paper and from that, master stone, pull the image and then place it onto different stones that then a printer would sort of trace the section that was only going to be in red, or the section that was only going to be in blue, or section only in green. And then they would ink it with that color. So it's quite a complicated process, but you always have that kind of keystone, is what they also call it, that has the full image that you can sometimes print. Sometimes they would print a version in black ink so you could get a sense of the kind of the tonal range and the composition, but from there they would separate all of the colors. And so that was where Clot especially was very helpful for these artists who might have drawn on the stone, but then needed help with that transferring of different colors onto separate stones. And of course, that process was more and more complicated. I mean, if you have 20 different colors, that process was going to be unbelievably complex. And oftentimes that was done manually. If that makes sense, I hope that's helpful.
Well, you do
Very complicated.
a beautiful job explaining it. In this point in my career, I have stopped explaining lithography and I send people to YouTube.
Yes.
And I would recommend the Museum of Modern Art has some really, really good videos on YouTube describing different printing processes. And it's very helpful to see how the greasy crayon is used on the stone. So I empathize with anyone who has to explain the process.
I know, and I've also had to read like many manuals from the 19th century describing it. It's very complicated. One thing I do want to convey, so part of my process of figuring out what this relationship between the printer and artist was that not only did I spend a lot of time with printmakers, but I also took a lithography class, just a brief workshop. And what I didn't realize was how much, I said in the talk that the relation, it's based on the kind of principle that water and oil don't mix. And so you're constantly wetting the stone, and then you're kind of fixing this image with chemicals onto the surface. And when you roll up, it's called the roll up, when you roll ink onto the surface, the ink, which is also greasy, only attracts to the oily, greasy drawing that you have on the stone, and the rest, which has been treated with water, repels that ink. And what I didn't realize until I did it was how kind of urgent everything is. There's something that's called the stone burning. Like if you don't have it constantly wet, the stone starts to burn. I don't know what that exactly means. It's not like it's actually burning, but something's chemically happening that's
bad.
Very bad. And so you're kind of running around dampening the, it's a multiple, it seems to me like it would be very complicated to, kind of pick it up casually. You really do need to sort of work with a professional or be a professional, because the whole thing, even beyond just the drawing of it, the whole process of printing is then incredibly labor intensive and very kind of messy and heavy. Those stones are unbelievably heavy. You can't kind of pick one up casually. You have to kind of lean it back against your body, move it, against your, and where you're gonna, drop it or something like that. They're very heavy, and they are also used for many, many, many years, so that one stone gets reused over and over again. So once an edition, in the case of Clot, once an edition was finished and the kind of plate was canceled, which is when you would kind of draw a big X over that surface, you'd print another version to show this whole thing is ruined, we can't use the stones again, and then you'd reuse the stone. So what you would do is you would wet the surface of the stone, and you'd either use a tool or you would use another stone face down, and you would grind the surfaces. So you would grind down that image, which is really just kind of sitting on the surface of that porous surface, and then you could reuse the stone again. And so those stones lasted, some of the ones from the 19th century, those are unusual because they've kept the image on the surface, but that means you can't use the stone. So those are kind of historical artifacts at this point, but in a working print shop, you would never leave the stone with an image on it, because basically it means it's unusable and they're very expensive. So anyway.
Natalia, there's another question about scale. So every image is 1-to-1, right? There. So if you have a big lithograph, you need a big stone. And before my computer crashed, I saw that there was a question about the wonderful screen by Bonnard, The Nursemaid's Promenade. So that was the sort of Japanese looking screen with 4 panels. And the size of the stones then would have been considerable. I'm trying to remember the dimensions of the screen, but over 4 feet high. Is that right?
Yes, so I'm not sure exactly what that screen in particular, but these stones were absolutely enormous. In very large posters, sometimes you'll see that they were printed with 3 stones. Then you'll see their registration marks, and clearly they were lining up different stones. But these stones could be really, really big. And so what I mentioned quickly in the talk was at a firm like Le Mercier, where, so for that cheese wrapper, let's say, they're not going to print one little wrapper at a time. They were going to print like 25 of those at the same time. So they take that stone and they would transfer, someone would, kind of like copy it with that paper I was talking about onto the stone many times, and they would print it. So these stones were absolutely massive. They all come from the same, or at least at the time came from the same quarry in Bavaria called Solhofen. And they were kind of like, they're basically, they're limestone. So they were kind of quarried out, but they could be in really big, kind of these like big flat surfaces that then were kept that size. They kind of carved out the sides and then would like ship them off. So yeah, they were very big, and that meant that they were unbelievably heavy. And yeah, like it was really quite an endeavor to print lithography in this period, and really now even. But that scale, you're not really. I don't think there's as much maybe in that scale now. Maybe some artistic lithography at a place like Gemini in Los Angeles. I'm not sure if they work in such large stones, but they exist definitely.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that that point up about labor, because that was really interesting how you talked about this whole erasure or elision of labor, the disappearance of Clot in the process. And as I hope, as people go through the exhibition, the lithographs look effortless. They look absolutely natural, like of course they were printed just like this. But I understand in your research that you've looked into a little bit in the role of labor, and which is something in art history we sometimes tend to parcel off. Did that lead you in some new directions for your research?
It did, because I was really interested in, first I was interested in this kind of production of color, where the labor is not only manual, but it's also this kind of aesthetic, subjective, intellectual project that, so that, this is kind of one chapter of my book project that is about, the kind of collaboration of labor of printer and artist in the production of color. But I have another chapter that's about really the manual labor of printing and how we can kind of find ways in art history to value that labor, that kind of manual craft and that kind of repeated skill that actually it kind of is something that we should really be thinking more about. And I work a lot with the sociologist Richard Sennett's text on kind of craft and artisanal labor, and really what in my research that took me into a direction of realizing that what was really helpful in this period, because there were so many of those chromos that I started the talk with, all of these kind of advertisements and all these posters and all of these really colorful chromos that we're kind of oversaturating the market in a way. These artists wanted to create something different. And so part of what that the way that they were able to market these things as original works of modern art was through this master printer's artisanal manual labor, like his great craft and skill. And so that was a really interesting avenue for me to explore and finding ways that we can kind of rethink the history of modern art, not only through collaboration, which I think is really important, but also if you look laterally, who else is involved and who else is doing some of the work that is, I think you'd find actually in many different, you have like Richard Serra, who's making these huge metal sculptures. There are many people involved there that we don't actually talk about, and Jeff Koons. There are lots of artists who are working with material that they don't necessarily control all of. So there's this kind of distinction between the idea an artist has and the kind of like manual craft technical skill that's required to actually make it. And I think that's a really interesting kind of methodology for thinking about histories of art.
You know, one role in the lithographic process, I didn't see in your slides, but I'm sure you've come across, were the young boys hired to carry stones around Paris. I don't know if they had a proper name.
They're called gamins, like little boys.
And you can find them in, there are depictions of them in 19th century art with these boys of carrying a, sort of leaning over with the big stone on their back, showing how they had to move around the city. So in the history of labor, I would like to give a shout out to the gamins who took them.
And some of these letters will say, oh, dear Clot, can you have your gamin come and get, bring me the stones for my project, which was like 10 stones. So I don't know how these, they must have used a cart. I have no idea, but I am also really interested in that. The kind of like physical, labor and these hugely heavy stones. I mean, there's like endless work we could probably do on that.
Okay, that would be our next project.
Exactly, perfect.
Natalia, I'm going to wrap up with some questions. Let's take it into modern times. We have heard you made a reference to Gemini, one of our contemporary print houses here in the United States. And the question was whether people are still working on stone or if the process has evolved. And can you talk about like what people are doing today versus 120, 30 years ago?
So I would say that even in Clot's period, so 1890s, lithography had already been around for a century. And one thing that they had done to kind of make the whole process easier was to switch from limestone to zinc plates. So you could use a much thinner plate and print from that surface instead. So around the time that Clot was making his color lithographs, the kind of industry had moved towards zinc. And so even the fact that he was using these limestones kind of helped to distinguish his practice as more sort of artisanal, kind of traditional, kind of helping to create yet another barrier between the kind of original artistic production that they were doing and these kind of commercial chromos. But, basically from the Atelier Clot in Paris, which, it moved to the Marais. It used to be in the 6th arrondissement, now it's in the Marais, but they still do traditional stone lithographic printing. So that's one place that you can go, and they only do lithography there. And then places like Gemini, Graphic Editions Limited, which is in Los Angeles, they do a lot of lithography there as well, although they also do many other kind of experimental, traditional and experimental practices. And the kind of major one that was involved in the West Coast, at least where we all are, was Tamarind Institute, which was, I think, established in Los Angeles first and then moved to New Mexico. So that was one of the kind of big ones that revived lithography in the United States. So it's definitely still in practice now, which is very cool. And I think the process is more or less the same as it was then. I mean, I think I spent a lot of time watching printers work with artists, and that still seems to be the kind of the major maybe difference that I've seen, is that instead of having a different kind of like publisher dealer, Volard in this case, so Volard working with Clot, who then worked with the artist, most of the printers now are the publishers themselves. So like the Atelier Clot, they're the ones who invite artists to come work with them, and they, publish the whole print edition, and they kind of orchestrate the whole thing, and including doing all the work of making the prints. And so there is this still very vibrant collaborative printmaking process that exists in the US and definitely in Europe as well. And it's more or less the same, which is exciting.
Well, Natalia, that was just marvelous. I very much hope that your lecture would be in person. I've been the most naive prognosticator about this pandemic. And I was really hoping I would get to take you out for a drink after your wonderful lecture. So please give me a rain check for that. I hope your wonderful family will treat you well. And please accept our thanks for this outstanding lecture and for being part of the exhibition.
Thank you so much again, Mary, for the wonderful welcome and for inviting me to do this talk. It was very exciting to have such an enthusiastic audience for color lithography in 1890s Paris, so I appreciate it. And it's really lovely to meet you, Heather, so thank you for being here. Congratulations on your show.
Thank you. Well, we hope our Portland audience will come see the show before we say goodbye. It's on the walls until January 23rd, and it is really a very unusual opportunity to see so many color lithographs printed by Clot in one wonderful package. So thank you and good night, everyone.
Thank you.